Let's see how this goes. So this is something that I think about a lot, the relationship of art to spiritual practice, because I have an art practice, so I've got a lot of thoughts. There's a lot of different ways I could have gone into this talk. So we'll see what I end up saying. So my question that was posed to me by Ratnaprabha was, is art spiritual? So that's to do with exploring whether the arts can be a path to the spiritual, whatever that is, and how creativity connects with deeper meaning and insight. And in terms of the particular emphases of Triratna, as Ratnaprabha was saying, in Triratna we have a particular valuing of the arts in relation to spiritual practice, in Dharma practice, and as a means of spiritual growth. And in a way, like, there's a whole world of talks that could be given on defining what art is and defining what spirituality is. I'm actually not keen on either of those words. I find them quite slippery, and they don't kind of communicate that clearly to me. But I guess we could think in our own experience, whether we're people who make things, or music, or we write, or whether we go and see art, we participate in art, does that contribute to our own sense of growth and development, expansion of consciousness? Does it connect us with deeper meaning and insight? Does it expand awareness? And does it contribute to the transformation of society as a whole? And so I was just thinking about just a few of the artists that I know, and thinking, well, is this true? And so one friend came to mind who's a quite brilliant electronic music maker and DJ. So she's got a lot of the traditional attributes of an artist. She certainly lives in a garret. She's really creative. She works on her music all hours of night and day. It's her life. She's really out and about on the music scene, just very creative person. Loads of drugs in that scene. It's all kind of part and parcel. Is that spiritual? That's the question. And then I know lots of psychogeographers and people who do urban exploring and walking and making, urban art makers, and they do really, a lot of them do really good, interesting, critical, creative work. Is that work spiritual? And then the Cable Street mural popped into my mind. So I don't know if you know that mural, but it's a big mural in East London, and it shows a clash between the police and protesters in 1936, when the local community came out to take a stand against fascists marching in East London. And that mural, it's huge, and it's a bit of a pilgrimage site. Lots of people go and look at it. It's like the way the mural is made is influenced by artists like Diego Rivera and Goya and Philip Guston. So it's in an art dialogue. And it affirms values, particular strong values. It celebrates collectivity, it celebrates community. And then I thought of people who I know who are Buddhists, who make Buddhist icons, rupas, specifically Buddhist paintings, you might do that in a traditional way, or you might do that in your own kind of, using your own language. So there's an order member who makes ritual tools in a sort of a Tibetan style ritual tools like vajras and choppers and those kind of implements, but he makes them out of welded metal, like screws and tools and things. There's another order member I know who makes Buddha and Bodhisattva figures out of carved wood and scrap materials, and they're quite shamanic. And so, well, are those automatically spiritual because of the content? Like they've got this Buddhist content. Does that make them automatically spiritual as works of art? And then if you think of all the people who make multiples of images, or who make cards, who turn images into cards to sell, yeah, same question. Do we think of that as spiritual practice? And we used to have in Bethnal Green, just round the corner from the London Buddhist Centre, a Buddhist arts centre, and I worked there with a team of friends for over 10 years actually, and I had a studio there. And I found that, well, we had artist studios there, and we also had 2 big rehearsal spaces. So all sorts of people would come and use those rehearsal spaces. And I found that I could often tell what kind of practice people had by how they were in their body, by their bearing, by their energy, by their kind of the quality. So we had opera companies, we had clowns, we had physical theatre, we had dance people, and all of those are collective practices. So there's a quality of collectivity and a capacity to connect and work together that you'd find amongst the theatre and the opera companies. So people who are training and moving together, in listening to each other. And often there was a real quality of uplift I found in people's being. There was one company of jugglers who used to use the space regularly, and we were always really happy when they were there, because they were just the most, you know, that when you're meditating, often we're kind of looking for the qualities of gravity and grace, so earthness and uplift. And they really, really embodied that. There's a kind of bright, grounded but uplifted quality to their energy. So I think how people come together has an effect on their being. And if you spend all day listening to each other and moving with each other and trying to express something collectively that you care about, in order to be able to then communicate it to other people, it will have an effect on your being and on the quality of your life. So that was really visible in a lot of those performance and movement companies. And then we also had people who were just in their studio making paintings or something, so solitary painters. And that's very, very different to be in the studio on your own, following a personal vision and then looking for a way to kind of express that. And then there are community arts projects. So I worked for a while for a community arts project, a Buddhist project in East London, which the projects were things like creating storytelling circles for women who are refugees or immigrants, who often there would be several different languages in the room. And that kind of work is collaborative and connecting, expressive, and it's transformative for the people who take part. And I hope that then has a ripple out effect in people's lives more widely. So all of these different practices, it's so many more could mention, they're all in the arena broadly of art. They're all creative practices, but they don't have the same context and they don't have the same aim. Yeah. So I think creative practice and creative expression is a really, really good thing for human beings. And but if I think, is the art world spiritual, in the sense of, does the art world have spiritual purpose? does the art world want to be a genuine force for good in the world? Well, obviously, I would say no. Much of the art world, much of what people are doing when they're participating in that arena is that people wish to get known and people wish to sell work. And those things aren't necessarily bad. It's all good for, I celebrate artists who manage to kind of make their way. But it's just that that's not the same goal. It's not the same goal as the goal of spiritual practice. So, so in that sense, I would say art is art spiritual. Well, only sometimes art's spiritual. It really depends what it's in the service of. And then just thinking a little bit more about this point that, why art is considered so valuable in Triratna. And so this, particularly Sangharakshita, was very, very keen on this. It was very important to him. And I think, so one reason is, I think there's something to do with the nature of his personality. So his mind responded very strongly to images, to myth, to symbol. He was also a very, very clear thinker, but he had a strong impulse himself to create, and he also had a great sensitivity and aesthetic sense. And there's this quite famous story that you'll hear in Triratna, famous in Triratna that is, that Sangharakshita had in his inner world. He talked about having almost like two versions of himself, so Sangharakshita 1 and Sangharakshita 2, and so the poet and the monk. And when he was younger, he felt those two to be very, very much at odds with each other, sort of in like a lot of tension and kind of fighting with each other. And he once described that, he said that he thought that tension was strong enough that if he hadn't found a way to work with it, it would have torn him apart. So he did eventually resolve, I think, as far as I'm aware, he resolved that tension. But it had to be resolved at a higher level. It couldn't be resolved by one within the polarity. And so my sense of Sangharakshita is that he had a channel, something like a channel open in himself to a higher mode of experience. And that included art and a higher mode of vision. Included art, writing, visionary experience. And it was out of that the movement sort of manifested, was set up. So, and then something also about, why the arts are valued in Triratna. I think there's also something about the nature of the Buddha's vision. So the Buddha's vision, spiritual vision, his enlightenment experience, was a direct, deep spiritual vision that was beyond concepts and words and even beyond symbols. So the Buddha's enlightenment experience, we're told, was more like a direct encounter with reality, a direct encounter with the way things are, that was powerful enough to change everything in him forever, and powerful enough to still be reverberating 2,500 years later, right down here to the North London Buddhist Centre. And so that direct spiritual vision can't be communicated in its fullness. We have to find it ourselves with the help of the Dharma. And and although we do need clarity about what the Dharma is actually saying, it's indispensable. We do need to use our intellect, we need to use our intelligence, else we can't know how to practice, we can't know when we've gone down a dead end. But we also need to engage those parts of ourselves that have a different kind of intelligence, that know and understand in a different kind of way. So more intuitive, appreciative, open to subtle meaning in a different kind of way, and to meaning that communicates more readily or more completely through images, through nature, through story, through music. So symbols and story and image can be a way to approach the Buddha's vision, come into relationship with it more intuitively and with less interference from the aspect of the mind that is overly reductive and that gets the concept and thinks it's understood when it hasn't. So myth is sometimes described as the realm of undefined meaning. And I think art practice in all of its different modes can engage with that realm of undefined meaning. And art practice allows things, or can allow things, to be unresolved yet still in relationship. So it's able to hold things that don't yet come together in tension or in juxtaposition, and allow them to clarify through a non-rational, non-linear process. So I often find that if I'm working with something, whether it's writing or whether it's in the studio, I don't know why I'm doing what I'm doing, but I know that it needs to happen. And there's something about being in the studio that lets that process unfold. So, yeah, another reason why the arts are considered important in Triratna, important to spiritual practice. So we've had something about Sangharakshita's particular personality, something about the nature of the Buddha's vision, and now I think there's something about the nature of the Buddhist path itself, which means that there's a kinship or identity between art practice and Dharma practice. And I think creativity is what is held in common between those two. And if I'm sort of made to say what I think counts as art and what doesn't count as art, which I never like to do, I mean, I both as an artist and as a Dharma practitioner, I'm really not about defining what does and doesn't count for art in a way that shuts anything down, because I think creativity is like that. Creativity is so easy to stifle, and I think, yeah, it's so easy to end up in this space of shutting down possibilities. I think it's the same with meditation. If you get into overanalyzing whether your meditation is right or not, the whole thing just grinds to a halt. So I think, in my experience, creativity is hard won. It's often like a small shoot or a weed in our being, in my being. So it's like something that's small that is able to move more freely and needs encouragement and needs the space to do that. And some of that, I think, is that it can be very hard won to find a space in a materialist, utilitarian society for spiritual practice and for any kind of creative practice. It's very, very hard won. So I think creativity is there it's there in all of us. It's something of the nature of being a human being. And I think if we value it and nurture it, if we're lucky to have in our life the space and means to do that, then it will grow. And creativity is at the heart of the Buddhist path. So one way to describe the path which is my favourite way, is that it is a path of continuously unfolding creativity. A path of continuously unfolding creativity. And that's definitely not confined to art practice. It's at the heart of Buddhist practice. And I think it's at the heart of what makes it good to be a human being. So I'm sure that most people know the teaching about working with the reactive mind and encouraging the creative mind, and how this can, like getting hold of that teaching can help us to start to work with our experience, so that we can really start to free up our experience. So that teaching about the reactive versus the creative mind is to do with working with our habitual reactive patterns of thought and behaviour, and finding a place where we have enough perspective that we can stop in our tracks, not do the habitual reactive thing, the contracting, familiar old thing, but instead open up a space where fresh, creative, ethical modes of thought and expression can emerge if they are given the chance. And the Dharma says that practice of stopping and waiting right before acting on the habitual reactive mode, stopping and waiting, and stepping into a creative, responsive mode, that practice goes very, very deep. And that if we keep practicing that, over time our habits transform. And we'll find our way into new ways of being that are fed by much deeper resources, fed by deep resources of energy and happiness and freedom. And also that we'll develop more of an ability to be in the world in a fresh, present kind of way, a fresh and natural way. And that being able to be like that will allow us to respond to people much more freely, and respond to world problems and situations in a resourced, positive way, with clarity and with imagination. So the reason this works, I think, is because the core principle of the Dharma is conditionality. Nothing exists in and of itself as a solitary, isolated thing. Nothing is fired under its own steam. All things are in a process of arising and falling, conditioned by everything else and in relation with everything else. So if we can find our way into a deeper understanding of that principle, so it's no longer a principle, it's an experience, a direct experience, at the heart of things, so the Dharma tells us, things are unfixed, ungraspable, vivid, alive. And what we're doing in practicing the path is aligning ourselves with that continuous creative unfoldment which is at the heart of everything, and trying to inhabit that more and more. So if Dharma practice, you could say, is a deep practice of aligning with that innate creativity and spontaneous aliveness, at its best, art, music, creative practices can exemplify this, can put us in touch with it, can express something of that, give us a sense of it. And I think having an art practice can be a close to home way of being in a kind of working ground in relation to that. So I was thinking how I thought it had a memory of my family. So in my family, creativity when I was a kid was really valued. But there was also this really stifling view that some people had got it and some people hadn't. And there was nothing you could do about that. And it was never quite said out loud, but it was very insidious. I think it's the genius idea. So you've either got it or you haven't. And I think what that means is there can be no learning about failure or success, or about, it's like a mysterious missing link to how you actually do it. And so I think that while Buddhism does very definitely say some of us are more developed than others of us, and some very much more so, it also says that we can all develop, and it offers a concrete path for doing that. So it's not a given that, that mode of being is not just something you have got or you haven't got. So to me, the Dharma offers that missing link that wasn't there, that was sort of baffling me when I was a kid. That actually there is a mechanism for becoming more creative and for finding our way into that mode of being. So I think sometimes it's like trying to generate something like a piece of writing or something in the studio, whatever it is, or it's even like sitting to meditate with no expectations. It's like all of that is a working ground with that. It's like again and again, look for the missing link. The link is here. I can find it. It's not that there is some given genius thing that just lands and you either have it or you don't. It's like we can learn to meditate and work with our minds, and that quality of creativity can be found because it is there. It's always there. Okay, I'm going to skip that bit. So I thought I would just say a few things about I've been thinking about how art's so varied. It's such a big subject, and it's something people hold really strong opinions on. And so thinking about how art practice and Dharma practice fit together, I started to think, one way to think about this is through the mandala of practice, and applying that to art practice. So my guess is that a lot of you have heard of the mandala of practice or the system of practice. We focused on it quite a lot last year, I think, here. But in case anybody hasn't or can't really remember, so it's a way in Triratna that we've come to talk about the whole picture of Dharma practice. So looking at how different aspects or dimensions or areas of practice fit together so that we can sort of see it as a whole. And we often talk about the mandala of practice in terms of meditation, but it can be applied to all aspects of our Dharma life. And so you can look at the system of practice as a path. So you do one stage and then the next and then the next. Or you can look at it as a mandala, which is more in the round, so different aspects around the purpose of deepening spiritual practice. So the first stage is the stage of integration. And usually, well, that's to do with mindfulness and awareness. And I think this is in a way, this is the easiest one to talk about in relation to art practice, because it's, I think it's the easiest one to spot. So a quote from an artist called Brian Maguire: the best of art functions not as decoration, but as a guide to ourselves. So I think that's in this sort of arena. And Sangharakshita said about this stage, the stage of integration, the first thing that one has to do is to develop awareness, especially self-awareness, which in turn means self-integration. We bring all our scattered bits together. We integrate ourselves. We overcome conflict and disharmony within ourselves. We get ourselves functioning as a smoothly working whole, not a jumble of bits and pieces or a heap of fragments of selves, all jostling for supremacy. You can begin to see that this is quite a big task in itself, but this is the first stage, giving birth to oneself as an integrated person, as a self-aware individual. Yeah, so there's lots more to say about that. For instance, in terms of, well, Sangharakshita talks about, he uses the figure of the artist as a kind of exemplar of what that integrated individual would be. And the way he talks about it is quite a high bar, so most artists probably wouldn't sort of reach this full integration, fully integrated individual kind of figure, because we're works in process. But I think there is something about art practice that in order to create things, you have to carve out space and time, and you have to guard that. You do have to make the work that you need to make, and you have to have the confidence and vision to pursue that. And you have to keep doing that regardless of what the world throws at you. That's how work gets made. So I think that entails a practice of becoming more individual, potentially, in the sense of not being swayed towards just following the group mode, following what the crowd is doing. The danger, of course, is that you end up kind of just really asserting a kind of unintegrated individuality against, so you become individualistic rather than an fully integrated individual. But that's a big subject, which I won't go into more here. But I was also thinking that I think a lot of contemporary work kind of does this function of integration in a way, for society as a whole. So so thinking about practices, there's a lot of work, like if you go to Tate Modern or somewhere, there's a lot of work focusing on sort of bringing in and giving voice or expression to that which has been excluded in society, or reclaiming things that have been lost or devalued. Works that examine colonialism, imperialism, either kind of culturally or through individual artists' stories. And I think in a way that work is doing a job of integration for society. And it has value, it has an important value in doing that. So I'll just move quite quickly through the next couple of stages. So the next stage of the mandala of practice, system of practice, is positive emotion. And that's often described as skillful volition, which has a more ethical and directive kind of dynamic sort of sense to it. So this is to do with, in spiritual practice, we cultivate a ethical, sort of uplifted kind of quality, a clear conscience and a warm, creative response to other beings. And certainly, I think we can find our way to this through absorption in meditation. That's one way, but also art practice can be a way into those qualities. It can be easier for a lot of people. I think sometimes people struggle with being absorbed in meditation, but actually we can find our way to it through doing something that we love. So I think that can be a very valuable way in making art, looking at art. And works of art, I think, can certainly transform experience and uplift, open up and connect. So that's positive emotion very briefly. Receptivity. So the stage of spiritual receptivity in meditation. But I think that in terms of art practice, it's a very, very good training in receptivity. Whether you're making work or whether you're kind of encountering work. So being in the studio, for me, it only works if I have an attitude of play and exploration. I need to have an attitude of openness to what will unfold. I have to get myself there. I have to cross the threshold into the studio or to the desk or wherever, same as getting to the meditation cushions. And then it's like a mixture of engaged waiting, paying attention, trying things out, and staying alert to what emerges, looking for where the life is and following that. And I think like in encountering and appreciating music or art or writing or whatever, you have to be receptive and you have to allow it to affect you. So I'm going to put the last two stages of the system of practice, the mandala of practice, together. So spiritual death and spiritual rebirth. So these are the stages of spiritual transformation. So I was reading last week the transcript of a talk that Sangha actually gave in something like 1976 on the Wheel of Life, the Tibetan Wheel of Life, or the Wheel of Becoming, which is a Tibetan Buddhist symbol. And that symbol is the whole of existence depicted as spread across a number of realms or worlds. And those worlds or realms correspond to a being's state of consciousness. So you have the state of consciousness and you sort of have a world that outwardly manifests that. So you have an inner experience and an outer manifestation, and those two are interlinked. So one of those realms is the realm of the gods with a small g. So in Buddhism, gods are just beings with a happier or more elevated state of consciousness. And it's not considered a particularly good thing spiritually to be a god or to be in the god realm. So the gods have a really refined capacity for appreciating beauty. They've got well-being and they've got resources and they've got enjoyment, but they don't have a motivation for spiritual development. So in this Wheel of Life talk, Sangharakshita talks about a figure, a person called Ashvaghosha, who was around in something like 100 CE, and he was a Buddhist monk. He was a philosopher, but he was also a dramatist, a poet, and a musician. He was really renowned as for his poetry and for his music and dramas, as well as for teaching the Dharma. And in this talk, Sangharakshita describes how the story goes that there was a Chinese monk called Yuan Chan. And so generations after Ashvaghosha's time, he was traveling in places where Ashvaghosha had been. And Ashvaghosha had been in these villages, towns, playing music. And this monk said, like generations later, the memory of the music and how it affected people was still alive amongst people. So going back to the Wheel of Life, in the God realm, there's within the image, every realm has got a Buddha appearing holding an object that is the thing the beings in that realm need in order to awaken. And in the God realm, he holds a musical instrument. So this is a quote this is Sangharakshita. That melody that the Buddha plays in the God realm is itself the melody of impermanence. It communicates the message of impermanence, just that melody. That reminds me of the story of Ashvaghosha. He was not only a great philosopher and great spiritual teacher, apparently he was a great musician. He went all over India in medieval times, playing upon a lute, a vena, and Yuan Chan, who visited that area, followed it in his footsteps, as it were, a few centuries later, and tells us in his memoirs of his sojourn in India, and that the effect of Ashvaghosha's music was such that when people heard him playing upon his vena, they at once got a sense of, it's all impermanent. They at once got a sense of everything conditioned is unsatisfactory, all worldly things are insubstantial. Just by listening to the music, they got that sort of feeling, that sort of impression, that sort of experience. There weren't even any words to the music. It was music without words, if you like, songs without words. But the music, the melody itself, condensed that. So it's the same in the case of the Buddha playing on the vena, the melody of impermanence to the gods. Waking up those who are in this higher, admittedly, but somewhat complacent and self-satisfied state of higher aesthetic experience, awakening them to higher transcendental truths and realities through the medium of the music, through an artistic medium. In other words, not through a philosophical, religious, or intellectual medium. So the music brings awareness, and that was transformative enough that that's carried in the memory of the people who've heard it through generations. It carries death in it, impermanence. Death is part of impermanence. That's the bit that hits us usually. But it's also beautiful. So it's expressed through beauty, and so it's saying both of those things. It's saying beauty and it's saying impermanence. So I think art can communicate from someone's higher or fuller experience to us, and it can give us a doorway into that experience if we're lucky to encounter that. It can give us a sense of something beyond our current level of awareness. It can clarify something in our being. And in terms of having a making or an art practice, we draw on the best of our skill, our capacity to understand, our capacity to express something through materials, including the body, our imagination, and we put it out there in the world to be tested, and we get something back. We get something reflected back. So going back to this thing of Sangharakshita, Sangharakshita's tension between Sangharakshita 1 and Sangharakshita 2, the poet and the monk, and those two seeming at odds and pulling against each other. So the faculty that resolves those kind of tensions in our being is, we talk about as the imagination with a capital I, not small imagination, but a kind of a higher imagination, transformed imagination. So reason and intellect won't take us all the way to the Buddha's vision. Emotion won't take us all the way, but we need both of those, but we need them working together and resolved into something else. So the faculty that we're talking about is imagination. And that's the faculty that perceives the truth. And I think that's the faculty that was in play when the people in that story heard the music, felt the music, intuited the meaning of the music without a need for words. And something happened that lasted through generations. Yeah, so just to kind of conclude, I mean, I think there is an affinity between art practice and spiritual practice, but just like with spiritual practice, you have to actually do it. You have to do the work. We have to do the work on ourselves, and it depends what it's in the service of. So if art practice is in the service of the system of practice, if it's in the service of the Buddhist vision, art, I'd say yes, art is spiritual in that sense, but it's not, it doesn't just come sort of ready-made.